So we move into Chapter 12, Forecasting Costs and Revenues. For my review of the OT questions on this particular paper, MA, certainly this is a go-to chapter, absolutely. It has some formulas and some calculations that may propose or a few challenges to students, I guess, depending upon your sort of comfort with working with formulas, working with square roots, etc. So let's take a look. We're talking about, in section 1 here, the correlation coefficient and indeed the coefficient of determination. We'll move into part 2 over on the left-hand side. So first off, what do we mean by correlation? We mean how strongly related two variables are. If they are related, a change in one variable will cause a change in the other variable. The verb is correlate. Now, note that within the chapter itself, we've got a series of diagrams. I'd refer you to them. I've cut and pasted some into this mind map, but not all of them. This first area refers to sort of, the line of best fit. So obviously, and again, you're probably familiar with that term, we're talking about a graph line showing the general direction. You've got two variables, you're going to plot points, where are they heading. So in terms of some sort of examples, I've just picked two out here. Firstly, perfect positive correlation. You'll see the x and indeed the y-axis. You'll see the x's. You'll see that's really perfect heading from left to right. The next one I've picked is slightly down below, partial negative correlation, again heading downwards, and you'll see partial, obviously not quite bulletproof on that line, but there or thereabouts. Now there's several other examples. I would refer you to them within the study text itself. Okay, so that's the issue of sort of correlation. So what is this correlation coefficient? Well, broadly speaking, it's a sort of a measure. It's really the degree of correlation between two variables, and indeed we call it R. We have a formula. Now note, as you've seen within the study text, the formulas don't need to be learned. We can refer to the tables in the exam. And certainly my experience with students in this particular area and areas where we have not complex formulas, I don't think the idea of summing x and y is overly complex, but where you have formulas that have several variables in them, practice makes perfect. We can have the tables in front of us, but you can still get it wrong if you have not done enough questions, okay? And indeed banged out answers using your calculator. So there's the formula. You'll see use of that within the OT section of the course in this particular chapter. Remember, in the tables we don't need to memorize it. Now in terms of interpretation, let's be clear here when we think about the words correlation and indeed causation. So note, where we establish a correlation between two variables does not necessarily mean that one thing causes the other, i.e. causation. So the simple example, I've cut this out from the study text, maybe a positive correlation between sun protection cream usage and the number of people requiring lifeguard assistance while swimming. Clearly, there's no causation there, although there may be correlation. You've got more people outside, more people on the beach, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So let's be familiar on those terms. Now, what about the coefficient of determination? Sort of fairly similar. And really what we're talking about there is really the variation of the correlation coefficient. So it doesn't consider whether or not we're talking about a positive or indeed a negative. You remember from the diagrams. And very simply, it's calculated just R squared, as we saw up top, R being the coefficient. We simply just square it. So simple enough to calculate. Again, I'll refer you to doing questions. Let's look at part 2. I've split this up because of the size of it. We're going to move to high-low method. Now again, not overly complex. I do find some students more sort of geared or more interested maybe in the mathematical side. Some students a little bit of both. Some students really don't like the math side. We don't need to be mathematical geniuses to be able to use either the correlation coefficient or that formula from the tables, or indeed this area of the high-low method. What we're talking about in high-low is just really being able to split costs up, to split semi-variable costs into fixed and variable elements in order to make decisions. Okay, so what's the formula? Well, a semi-variable cost is equal to, obviously, a fixed cost and the variable cost per unit times the number of units. That's going to be the makeup of it. Okay, now in terms of sort of using it, or using the sort of linear function, as it were, so we'll look at the next section in a moment, but essentially the simple equation y is equal to a plus bx. So in terms of the linear function, really what we're saying there is that this function can be used to find the line of best fit rather than having to draw it on the diagrams that we saw on the right-hand side of the mind map. And it's simply done by inserting the results into the function, in effect using the high-low method. Now again, I know that talking of theory might lose a little bit in translation. You're thinking, okay, so there's a formula, what do we do? Well, I'm hoping that you have read through the chapter already, done the activities, so that this is really just an add-on. Now if you haven't done that, if you've come straight to the video, okay, but let's get back in and do the exercise and head towards the OT section of the course where we bang questions out. So in terms of the use of this linear function, working on splitting costs into fixed, semi-variable, etc., what would be the sort of main advantages and indeed disadvantages of using this approach? Well, first things first, I think certainly the formula is pretty simple. It's easy to understand, it's easy to use, and indeed it's pretty easy to use to determine fixed and variable elements of a semi-variable cost, even if we've got only just a couple of levels of activity, that's for sure. So simple enough. Excuse me. The flip side of that is if we don't have multiple activity levels, we may not get figures that are bulletproof. We'll get figures, yes, but we may not get bulletproof or very, very accurate figures. Outside of that, second key point here, it may well be that costs overall are affected by other areas, not just the activity of other things. So that undermines the usefulness. Okay. Let's move on to the next area, linear regression analysis. Again, a similar thing. Let's remember, again, we're really simply talking about the use of formulas, again, given in the exam, where we sort of analyze past information or past cost data to sort of calculate the values of A and B, our given variables. In effect, in the function of a line of best fit. Now, the formulas are there, as I say, they are in the tables in the exam. Now, in terms of forecasting costs and revenues using the formulas, certainly it would be fairly straightforward to just slot our figures in. If we have a relationship, if we've established a relationship, we simply need the formula, off we go. So you'll see the example there for Winston's football factory. We have that formula y is equal to 80 plus 15x. Bingo. We can predict the costs. So simplistic, but still useful. Now, difficulties, okay, outside of what we said, okay, so maybe we've established a relationship based on past information. We know that we can use these formulas to help us. Is that it? Well, not exactly. Because other factors, as we've just said, can influence things. So for example, if we think about pest, we think about these past factors. Political, as an example. Let's say something that changes in relation to trade barriers. That could manifestly affect our business. What about economic? A recession, reflation, exchange rates. What about social? Certainly lifestyle, people's disposable income, how they think, how they operate, their tastes. And indeed, over and above that, on the tech side, new production techniques that could manifestly impact upon the relationship between a set of given variables. Of course it could. Outside of that, other issues, I'm always reminded when I think about forecasting or predicting numbers, predicting costs and revenues, of that famous quote by J.K. Galbraith, who was an economist in the 20th century, and he said that he is quoted as saying that there's two types of forecaster: those that don't know and those that don't know they don't know. Yeah. So forecasting is difficult. When we think of, for example, let me just open this up a little bit better so you can sort of see. When we think of past data and we think of trends and seasonal variations that have occurred in the past, they may not continue. Just because they happened over the course of the last few years doesn't necessarily mean they're going to continue to happen in the future. So there's your first problem. Outside of that, excuse me, when we think about the future, here we're trying to forecast, let's say, costs and revenues. We're talking about the future. The longer time frame we're looking into, the worse it gets. Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen next month in today's modern dynamic business environment, let alone in 3 years' time. So, this is a major issue, a la J.K. Galbraith's quote. Outside of that, data. If we don't have a lot of data, if data is to some extent scarce or indeed limited, clearly that's going to affect the usefulness of the techniques that we discussed above. Okay? So, in terms of advantages and disadvantages, my apologies, let's take a look at the detail here. And this will bring in some of the points that we've already made. But let's really sort of sum up in one sense. Let me just bring this across. So we're thinking about this linear regression analysis, the formula that we saw up top. Now, again, I would say left-hand side here, yeah, it's pretty easy to use. Yes, I can use it to forecast costs and revenues. It could well be very, very useful. If we simply have just a couple of pieces of information regarding data sets, we can establish, or if we have established a linear relationship, we can forecast them. Absolutely. If we feel that the relationship is strong, then certainly the information that we get on costs and revenues could well be pretty reliable. Indeed, outside of that, it does use all available data, unlike the high-low method, which just uses observations. Now, in terms of disadvantages, many and varied. Okay, it suggests a linear relationship. We're assuming that, but it may well not be true. Outside of that, it's only using two variables. Okay, but as we've said up top, there may be other variables that affect things. In addition to that, again, we've made the point already that the way in which data or costs and revenues, let's say, have behaved historically, previously, may not be the case in the future. Things may change, political, economic, etc., etc. And indeed, outside of that, if we don't have a strong relationship, if they're not strongly linked, but we're sort of relying on them, the information that we get outputted could be rubbish. It could be irrelevant. We could be making decisions in the short to medium term based on figures that mean nonsense. Okay? So there's some key advantages and disadvantages. Okay? So, a fairly short chapter for us, and in terms of technical difficulty level, reasonably high. Not so much in, using a formula, but just sort of understanding really what's going on and the way in which the examiner presents these questions. For me, if I was a student that maybe was a little bit weak or not keen on the mathematical side, I would recognize the fact that just with a knowledge of the formula, i.e. from the tables, and just with the knowledge of the style of questions, in other words, put that number there, put this number in this part of the formula, you can get through quite a lot of the questions and get them right. I'm not saying every single one, because he'll present the information in different ways, but I'm trying to convince you that even if this area is a little bit tricky for you, we can still make progress and we can still get questions right without being experts on it. Okay, it's the same with many of the tech-heavy or technically heavy areas of the course. Again, we only need to get 50% of the answers right to pass the exam. To pass marks, not 100. We don't need to get all questions on forecasting and costs and revenues correct in the exam. Only 50% of them. Okay, so try and think like that going forward. It may well be that you're a mathematical genius and this makes sense. It's all very simple. Not every student is like that, but I'm happy for you. Okay, thanks for listening and good luck with the studies going forward.